Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Grand Rounds. Right, my name's Tom Fardon, and I'm the chair and organizer of Grand Rounds. And a couple of times a year, we join up Grand Rounds with a program organized by the Centre for Medical Education. And confusingly, a number of those talks are all called the Ronald Harden Awards or lecture or prize giving. And it has led occasionally to some confusion about who's giving what, where, and when. But this is definitely the Ronald Harden Lecture. And we are in the Wolfson Lecture Theatre today. It's a little bit chilly, but we have asked for the heating to be turned on. This is student temperature to keep them on their toes, but we are turning it up to professional level. And we're on Zoom, hopefully live as well. And you may be watching this on YouTube later once I've edited it and uploaded it. So I'm grateful for the people who've turned up to the audience and grateful to those in watching on Zoom. Grand Rounds has been going on now for 12 years under my tenure at least. And we did have our first ever Grand Rounds, not in this lecture theatre, but in what was Lecture Theatre 2, if you're long in the tooth enough to remember that, before lectures 2 and 3 were turned to this wonderful lecture theatre here. I'm not sure how many times we've joined up for the Ronald Harden Lecture, but it must be at least 10 years, I would have thought, by now. So many of those lectures are available on the YouTube channel if you want to watch them. And I do encourage you to do that because we've had some excellent speakers over the years. I'm going to shut up now and sit down, and I'm going to introduce Professor Susie Schofield, who's going to talk about, to introduce the actual lecture today. So thanks very much. I'll just nip her up away.
Thank you. So welcome, everybody. I'm absolutely thrilled to be introducing this lecture. For many of us, Ronald needs no introduction, but for those of us who are maybe not quite so aware of the enormous impact he's had in medical education, he is globally recognized as an innovator, significantly shaped medical education. He set up our own centre in 1972. He launched our Masters in Medical Education in 1985. He developed the OSCE. First paper was 1975, so 50-year birthday. SPICE's curriculum, outcome-based education, spiral curriculum, fair teaching principles. It goes on and on. The huge impact you've had, Ronald. Scholarly contributions, over 400 publications, and edited major medical textbooks, widely used. Former editor-in-chief medical teacher, held key leadership roles and received international honours. Again, I haven't put them all in, but Ronald, your OBE, the Hubbard Award, Karolinska Institute Prize, which is sort of the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in Medical Education, Miles Asney Gold Medal, Amy Lifetime Achievement Award, and the Guzzi Peace Prize for Medical Education, I found writing that slide. And again, my huge honor to welcome Jen Cleland, another giant in medical education. To have you both sat right in front of me is amazing. So Jen was originally trained as an occupational and clinical psychologist. She found her home in medical education in 2000. She moved her up the ranks to a personal, then endowed chair in 2011 in Aberdeen. Spent another few years there in senior management, and then decided to move to Singapore. And we're amazingly lucky to have you here in person. She brings in that outsider's view to ensure getting the right people in and through medicine and into the right jobs. And her work is huge, and it goes from selection through teaching and assessment to the influence on career decision-making, recruitment and retention. Again, huge contribution to research, scholarly contributions. She focuses on robust, conceptually driven research with practical utility. That's very much valued. Both of you, I would say, that's what you have really brought to medical education scholarship. Authored over 300 publications, delivered over 100 invited national and international talks, delivered over 101 now. And she has taken over from Ronald as the new editor-in-chief of Medical Teacher. So we're very excited again to have you both here. Again, lots of leadership roles, chair in medical education currently at Singapore, Wade Professor of Surgical Education Research for the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, another recipient of the Karolinska Institute Prize. And I found out your love of wine drinking meant that you were awarded WSET Level 3 in 2019. But she says that continuing that hobby in Singapore is too expensive. Huge welcome. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Susie. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. I'm so cold. It's freezing. I live in the tropics. To come somewhere without central heating. Oh, anyway, so I'm Jennifer Cleland. As you can probably work out, I am also Scottish. So, being the new editor-in-chief of medical teachers is quite nice because we're kind of keeping it in the country, which is always good. I'm going to talk today about. Am I going to talk today about something?
This should work. And doesn't.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tom. So when Susie invited me to give this lecture, I gave her 2 or 3 options for titles, and I gave her this one, and I thought that given Dundee's circumstances, this one might be the most apt for the current time. But this is also something that I've been talking about and researching for a number of years, working with a team of colleagues from across the world. So money, 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 considering the cost and value of medical education. So medical education is not a cheap business. In 2010, the Frank et al. Lancet piece indicated that the cost of medical education then was 100 billion annually. So that's 15 years ago. And of that, about 4.8 billion was spent in the UK. So clearly things will have gone up since then, but you get the idea, it's expensive. But our income, our expenditure has gone up, but our income has not gone up in a line with that. And the cost-income ratio is not particularly healthy. So many years ago in Aberdeen, I did a lot of work with the health economists. And that was really fascinating because they taught me to think in ways that I suppose we all think about money. We all think about our personal finances. Is there enough money coming in to pay the mortgage and keep the cars running and so on and so forth. But I'm not sure that I'd really taken that thinking into the workplace either, other than when I was costing out a grant. And those of you who have applied for grants, if you don't cost it out, you don't get it. So we can be very, very good at that. But are we quite as good at doing it when it comes to education? But everything that we do, again, working with the health economists, they taught me to think about choices, that there are always choices in what we decide to do. So if we think of being educators, some of our choices are about our curriculum. So do we give our students more stimulation or less stimulation? Do we do lecture-based teaching or some other form of teaching? Do we have a 10-station OSCE or a 15-station OSCE? All these things are choices, and these choices all have ramifications. So giving more feedback probably requires more faculty time and perhaps more training. And that means there's less faculty time for something else. And more simulation may be desirable in terms of skills development, but what activity shall it replace? Because there's only so many hours in the day. And, can the simulated patients, the rooms, the consumables, all these things be found and paid for? And more OSCE stations might increase reliability, but more OSCE stations means more examiners, more time, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. So we have to make choices all the time as educators. And every choice we make has a cost, whether it be financial or otherwise. So when, as I say, working and learning these kind of basics of economics, there's always limited resources. There's always trade-offs. Choosing one thing means giving up another. So I did a series of studies using discrete choice experiments, which was all about trade-offs. If you choose X, then maybe you have to give up Y. And there's everyday equivalents. So if I buy the newest iPhone at whatever the cost is now, then maybe I have to limp along with my old iPad for a bit longer. So we're always making these kind of trade-offs in our own decision making. There's opportunities costs, what we forgo by choosing option A over option B. And then there's this lovely notion of constrained optimization, which is making the best choice within limits. So this isn't how much money is in the pot, but how can we use it best? So in terms of education, what do things actually cost? I mean, I worked for 20 years at Aberdeen, and a lot of the time we didn't really know what things cost. And there's And we were actually talking about this over lunch. There's ACT, this additional contribution for teaching. And it would go into the hospitals and it was like money disappearing into a big black hole. We didn't actually know what happened to it. We didn't know how it was used, but we didn't really know what things cost either. And so a lot of the time we were trying to figure out what costs do we know? And they were typically costs that were within our control, but also what costs do we not know? And then obviously trying to find out more so that we knew more costs and so on and so forth. So there's always this kind of idea of getting the price and the balance between the price and the value. And my colleague, Stephen Maloney, who and co did an AME guide. Oh no, this isn't an AME guide, sorry, but they did do an AME guide looking at cost and value in professional education. And I'd just like to use this statement. The goal of considering cost and value in health professions education is to ensure that it delivers maximum educational value for a given spend. And I think this is really important. We can't just think about the cost. We have to think about the value. And I'm going to give some examples of that as I go along. I'll give 3 examples, or slightly more examples, but they're focused on 3 areas: assessment, selection, and teaching. So kind of there's 3 fairly mainstream activities of education. So starting with teaching. Many years ago, working with colleagues in Inverness, we developed a simulated ward round. Oh, I say we, I can't really take the credit. The colleagues in Inverness designed this and they just kind of pulled me in to help. And they were interested in teaching the students how to manage distractions when they were doing a ward round. So it was nicely planned with errors built in, or rather distractions built into the simulation. And I should have had another picture. Our then head of undergraduate teaching in Inverness, who was a surgeon, and he was one of the vice vice presidents of the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, John Duncan. He entered into this with great aplomb and dressed himself up as a cleaner and went around with a hoover. So you can imagine that these poor undergraduate students, when they realised who was hoovering around their feet, completely freaked out. And that really did distract them. It was a great test. So people did enter into, to make it a bit of fun. But the point was very serious, because if you do a ward round, it's not in beautifully controlled circumstances. There's all sorts of things going on in the background. So we designed it as a 30-minute ward round, then a 30-minute one-to-one feedback. Then after the feedback, the students repeated the simulation and got more feedback. So it was great. The students loved it. They learned. There were proper measurable outcomes. But it was flipping expensive. That's an hour per student. So however many students we had at that time, maybe it was 120 in a year, so multiply this up 120 times, because you can't give some students one thing and not give the others, not give other students the same thing. So while things improved in terms of reduction of errors, we just couldn't keep this up. We just didn't have the staff time, or indeed the ward time, the simulated ward time to do this. So we did a second study, and we used the same model of the ward round, but we cut it down a little bit. We made it 20 minutes, not 30 minutes, which might not sound much, but again, multiply it up by the number of students. And instead of giving every student 30 minutes individual feedback, we did a group of 6 to 8 students and gave them 60 minutes, but in a group repeat simulation assessment. So basically, the same format, but a bit less time, and this group feedback. And we found exactly the same outcomes in terms of learning and student satisfaction. But by doing what we did, we actually saved 50% of our costs. And those costs were things like staff time and use of the ward in simulated patients. So just those small tweaks, we kept the value of the learning, but we reduced the time and we made it more feasible. We could keep this up. We could achieve this with the resources that we had. So it's a fairly simple example, but it's an example of, if we hadn't looked at this and looked at the costs, we wouldn't have been able to work out how to save time and money. But I was looking for some more examples when I was preparing for this talk, and looking to see how are other people looking at this, because the examples from Inverness are quite old now. There's not an enormous amount of literature on this, and it's as if thinking about money is somehow I don't know, unsexy or unfashionable, or maybe it's just something that people don't do. And but I did actually manage to find this talk, which is about vascular anastomosis using virtual reality. So it was I think it's a Korean study. But what I really liked about it is they did a kind of randomized controlled trial with all these different groups, all these different options of no virtual reality, 3 hours, 6 hours, 9 hours, 12 hours, or 15 hours, huge amount of time. And each group had their outcomes assessed with a standardized examination and standardized scoring. And they found by doing this controlled study that about 8 hours was optional in terms of balancing proficiency gains with training efficiency. So there they've got some evidence-informed planning for their curriculum. So, okay, everybody should get 8 hours. That seems to be the best. But without doing this study, they might have given everybody 15 hours thinking more is better. But actually, more didn't seem to be particularly better. The learning gains kind of plateaued at the 8-hour point. So a useful study. And there needs to be more like this. This one was complex. There was a lot of modeling. There was a lot of stats. But that main message of there is an optimum time is really important. So we also did some work looking at selection. So selection is expensive, or can be expensive, and perhaps that's one of the things that this study indicates. So I was working with colleagues in the Netherlands, and as many of you may know, for 3 years the Netherlands had 2 systems happening in parallel. So you either got into medical school through the lottery, so it was really based on your grade point average. If you achieved a certain grade point average, then you could go to medical school if you so desired. But at the same time, the medical schools could also select people through their own procedures. So this was at Maastricht, and their program was outcomes based. It was blueprinted to CanMeds, and they blueprinted, so to speak, their selection process to the same principles, the same outcomes. So everything was aligned, the selection process, the curriculum, the assessment, and the outcomes. It was tidy. And they did it in 2 stages. The first stage was online portfolio. Yes, of course, your grade point average, but there was things like, writing an essay on why you wanted to go to Maastricht. There was some talking about why you thought problem-based learning would work for you. And then if the applicants got through that, then they were invited to an interview and a video-based situational judgment test. The point really is that this was a fairly intensive resource-intensive system, because this all involved lots and lots of staff time in terms of assessments. So we wanted to look at the relative effectiveness of each approach and compare them in terms of outcomes and costs. So this was kind of roughly the design of the study. So there's fixed costs and there's variable costs. So the fixed costs are the development and improvement of the processes, the communication with respect to students, all those emails or letters or whatever it might have been. The variable costs were things about like the grading of assessment. But then what about the benefits? Now, how do you measure the benefits of a selection system? And we looked at students having to repeat blocks, having to repeat years, whether they dropped out or whether they were retained, whether they had to have reset examinations. So we tried to look at the things that were kind of fairly meaningful in terms of progression. And we extrapolated the cost. So the lottery doesn't cost the medical schools anything. They receive the numbers of students who got the grade point average, who want to do medicine there. That's it. There is no cost to the medical school. But with the kind of what we were calling the bespoke selection process, there was a lot of cost in terms of admin time to develop and evaluate the assignments, to interview the students. There was equipment, there was biscuits for the selectors. We tried to put everything into the equation, and we found that the total cost was, and remember this was a long time ago. The total costs were 100 and €33,000 per annum for their selection process. Okay, so and this is of course only one of the things that happens in a medical school, only one of the activities. Now, I won't go through all of these figures, but because we're doing this retrospectively, we could look at the things like resets of exams and so on and so forth. And we looked at the gains and the costs. And we found out that although the bespoke selection process was expensive, that €133,000, the actual benefits in terms of student retention and student progression came out as higher than that, at around €200,000. So we said that the economic gains of the local selection process were better than the lottery. So that's you're kind of looking at the cost and value. And this is quite interesting. We looked at the clinical years, that was in the pre-clinical years. We then looked at when they went into the clinical years, the sort of 3 and 3, and assessed their performance against CanMed. So we found that there were differences between the two groups, the lottery group and the bespoke selection group, in terms of their outcomes on the CanMed's competencies, and these only grew in time. Okay. So again, it seemed as if this well-designed selection is worth the money. But it's really quite interesting in the Netherlands now. I'm actually going over in a couple of weeks to give a talk, because things have kind of blown up again. So the lottery system was abandoned in 2017, but then it was reinstated in 2023. And there's a huge amount of politics around this. There is a concern that local systems used in the medical schools between 2017 and sort of present day limited diversity. There doesn't actually appear to be any evidence that that's the case, but there is a belief that that might be the case. And in fact, there's a study that I'm just reviewing that kind of drills down to this, and that the local systems that limit diversity are at school level, not at the point of selection into medical school, which is very much the same in the UK. So there is a bit of a fight with the government at the moment and with the Netherlands Medical Council. Some of the universities, some of the medical schools want to keep their own selection model, like Maastricht. Some are quite happy to go with the lottery. So it's very political, and it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out. But Maastricht are using these studies as evidence that they should keep their bespoke system. So moving on to looking at assessment, this was a study driven by a colleague of mine in Aberdeen, but just many of you will be familiar with this utility equation. So Chris van der Vlutten's assessment is about reliability times validity times educational impact times cost times acceptability. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of papers published on some aspect of selection. And I would say that 99.9% of them look at either validity or reliability. And, I've done some of them myself. That's what everybody looks at. But what about the cost? Assessment is really expensive. So my colleague, Craig Brown, who at the time was in charge of the final year OSCE in Aberdeen, he was quite new into the job, and he went, "My God, this costs so much money." And I was like, "Well, does it? We don't actually know how much it costs." So we literally went and unpicked the OSCE and tried to unpick the costs of what we spent, literally down to, well, I've said here consumables of marking sheets. But the biscuits, the costs of biscuits were quite high. We had all these OSCE examiners, we had simulated patients. Everybody wanted, don't know if you have them here, but there was little double packs of posh biscuits, Borders biscuits. We went through thousands of those over the OSCE timetable, and that wasn't included. Well, maybe it was including the ones that we all pinched at the end of the OSCE to have in our offices. So we really tried to drill down up to all the costs, no matter how small they seemed, because it's all cost. I just thought I was going to digress. Many years ago, NES used to do a conference, the Scottish Medical Education Conference, and it was at the beginning of April. It used to be in person, and it was great fun. And one year, the head of NES, Stuart, had asked if I would suggest some speakers to invite. So we got Brian Hodges over from Canada. And he was great. He was really good. And I knew he would be, but Stuart came up to me later and went, how he was really good. And you know, it costs less to have him here than we've spent on biscuits. So I told Brad and he said, oh, right, okay. I'm pleased that I was kind of an economic choice. So anyway, going back to the OSCE, we calculated the direct costs of things that we actually paid for at £65,000. And that was published in 2015. So I think we were using the data from 2013 or 14. So it's more than 10 years ago. Goodness knows what it would be now. But if we'd taken into account the cost that we didn't pay for directly, which was really external examiner time or clinician time, then it would have risen to nearly £90,000 for that one exam. So we were running OSCEs for every year. And okay, the final year OSCE was a big one, the most station, the highest of stakes. But you know, add them up over 5 years, even your little year one, your little year two one. Then, of course, there's the written exams, which are not staff heavy in terms of the presence of staff on the day, but they're staff heavy in terms of the time it takes to prepare assessments and then to mark assessments. So, sorry, let me just do this. So when we saw that, we thought, well, have we got this money? Can we afford to do this? And the head of assessment at that time, Graham Curry, said, well, you know, there's this thing called the sequential OSCE. And then people hadn't really heard of it. There was a few papers published, but nobody really knew much about it. So, but we thought this is probably the way to reduce the number of stations while maintaining the sensitivity and specificity. And just to explain, that's what a sequential OSCE looks like. So if you pass, so let's say everybody sits 10 OSCE stations. If you pass those 10, if you meet the predetermined criteria, then that's it. You've passed. End of story. If you fail, then you have to do more stations on a separate day. And then, of course, you might fail that and then you fail, but you might pass. It's almost a second chance. So this was a way to, instead of 200 students doing 15 stations, we could have 200 students doing 10 stations, and then only the 20 who did badly doing the sequential OSCE, doing the second day, thus saving time and money. So Graham then did a master's bioresearch and he modelled the potential use of the sequential OSCE on retrospective Aberdeen data, years and years of data. And he identified the ideal number of stations in terms of sensitivity and specificity. And the number was 8. We were doing 15 at the time. So really, we were just about halving what needed to be done. But it was interesting. It was really unpalatable to colleagues. People were really scared about doing it because, oh, what if we let them, you know, what if we let a bad one sneak through? And we did some other studies and the students didn't like the idea either because they saw coming back for the second day of an OSCE as failure. And we were like, no, failure's failure. Coming back for the second day of an OSCE is giving you another chance. But there was a real kind of negative mindset about it. But you know what? They had to change things because the final year OSCE was so expensive and money is tight and resources are tight. So now all the year 5 students complete 12 OSCE stations on day 1. So they didn't go for the 8. That was just obviously, it was a bit, you know, a step too far, although 8 was okay. 12, you can do a bit more blueprint and you can be a bit broader, fine. But 12 is better than 15. And as per the model of the OSCE, if they reach a predetermined standard, that's it, off they go, fine, you've passed. And if not, they have to come back and do 9 additional stations. So actually, if you do badly in day 1, you're really scrutinized afterwards. And obviously there's things about where do you set the pass mark, just as there would be with any exam. But I believe that those who brought in the new OSCE, the sequential OSCE, are looking at the cost to see how much is saved and obviously the value. So that's 3 examples. So just to summarize, with assessment, the cheaper option was just as trustworthy, but acceptability took quite a number of years. Selection, the more expensive option was better in terms of educational gains or value. And in terms of teaching, there will be sweet spots in terms of learning, that 8 hours rather than 15, for example, and cheaper might be just as well received, although student satisfaction is not exactly the ideal outcome measure. But the nice thing here is they all illustrate different study designs as well, from the fairly simple, what did it cost of that first OSCE assessment, that first OSCE, you know, how much did our final year OSCE cost, to the more cost-effective analysis of the selection studies. So, identifying the costs of what we do can be done. Well, it takes a bit of time, takes a bit of imagination in a way, like don't forget cost in the biscuits, for example. But it's not particularly complicated. It's assessment, and it's counting things up. It's making a list of what did we pay for, counting it up, and what did it cost. And okay, again, sometimes certain costs have to be estimated, you know, of the OSCE examiners, how many of them were senior consultants, how many of them were slightly more junior consultants. Well, we just had to take a kind of guesstimate of an average consultant salary, but that does for the purpose of the exercise. And also, the more that you do this type of analysis, the more data that you have at hand. And there is useful guidance. These particular papers, one of which is the medical teacher, help spell out how to do this, what are the ingredients, and how to calculate them. But it is important to be rigorous in this research. So, you know, what about the outcome measures? As I said earlier, student satisfaction is, unfortunately, overused in terms of an outcome measure. Our students liked it. Well, like I care. Sorry, but that is not a good outcome measure. Did they actually learn? It's always nice to know. Did they learn from what we did? You know, that kind of level 2 of Kirkpatrick. We're not very good in medical education generally at going beyond did they learn in terms of an immediate learning. We're not very good at looking to see if that actually changes their behaviour. Did it actually change anything when they got, you know, into real clinical practice? But let's be realistic. It's really difficult to do these kind of long-term assessments of our teaching impacted something way down the line. But at least go beyond satisfaction and look at, did they actually learn something? And try to look at what's a reasonable outcome, what's a relevant outcome for medical students, for residents, whatever it might be. But as a field, we need to think about what's a educationally significant improvement. You know, we talk about statistical significance, we talk about clinical significance. What about educational significance? That's something that we need to work on developing as a field. So we do need to be better at assessing the cost and value of what we do. But of course, it's not all about the money. There are factors other than cost and value driving the decisions we make when we have to put in health professions education. So one of the things, you know, medical teacher gets 60 or 70 papers a week, and lots of them are looking at educational technology, often not very well. But when we look at papers on virtual reality, we have papers on augmented reality, we have artificial intelligence for personalized learning and so on. Everywhere you go, people are talking about the new technologies and how they can be used in education. And of course, we're having to prepare our students to work in increasingly digitally mature healthcare environments. And we have to prepare our students for going into these systems. And AI is already influencing how, you know, workflows, diagnosis, and so on and so forth. I'm slightly cynical about some of the educational tools or the high-tech educational tools that we are kind of encouraged to buy. And I wanted to give you a cautionary tale. I was Vice Dean of Education in Singapore for 5 years, and there was a lot of pressure put on me to buy really expensive educational kit. And, you know, it's not difficult to do. You go to a conference and all the stands, somebody's trying to flog you on an anatomage table or a this or that or the next thing. And I took some of my colleagues to Amy a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years when it was in Perth, you know, when it came back after COVID. And they got really excited by these kind of virtual or augmented reality communication skills packages. And I was like, okay, I'm not really sure I get it myself, but you know, I'm old and a bit crap with technology and I'm not a student. So okay, let's go with it. So we bought the package and we piloted it with our first and second year students, and they liked it. Student satisfaction again, and they thought they learned from it. We don't know if they did, but we thought, okay, well, all right, I was persuaded. So we purchased the licenses and we made this package available to all the students. So you guess what happened? None of them used it. None of them used it. We had about 5 people go in and use the package. And I'm like, so that was 71,000 a year, which in UK money is about £50,000. Push out of my budget, complete waste of money. And it was a really good learning for me, because one of the reasons was that we hadn't planned this properly. If we'd integrated it into our curriculum and made it perfectly clear that they had to do this to say progress to working with a simulated patient, if everything had been aligned, then yes, it would have been used, because they would have had to do it. You know, use the package. Then once we see in the system that you've used the package, only then would you be allowed to do X. But we didn't. We went, oh, here you are. Look, it's here if you want it. Complete waste. So yeah, it was good learning. And so we had no return on investment, money down the drain. But the students, if things are optional, are often seen as unimportant. So there is lessons about alignment and integration. The other thing I'm a bit cynical about is this kind of AR, VR as pre-simulation. Before I go any further and put my foot in it, do you have an AR, VR suite here with headsets for your students? Nobody's admitting to it? No? Not as a suite, okay. So how do they use it? Do they? Okay, yeah. Yay, yay. I'm so pleased to hear that because, yeah. Oh, right. Oh, sorry. So you said that you're not going to use it. No, okay. So you have the headsets, but you're not going to use, you have some. Okay, thank you. I went to visit another medical school in Singapore a few months ago, and they had a suite of rooms with the headsets and, you know, the floors marked out and so on. And I thought, oh, but there's nobody here. And they were like, oh, the students can come in and use it when they want. And I'm like, oh, so how often do they do that? Oh, well, they don't do it very often. And I'm like, so how much was all of this stuff? And also rooms. So to be, you know, rooms and space is a resource as much as anything. So if you're putting aside rooms for headsets and these rooms aren't, you know, those rooms can't be used for something else. They can't be used for staff. They can't be used for whatever. But, you know, is it necessary? You know, people are talking about using AR or VR as a kind of almost like a level before simulation, like a kind of prep for simulation. Does it make any difference? Yes, okay, the students might like it, of course, but does it actually add anything to learning? And I did see a paper recently that indicated that students who had some AR, VR, can't remember the focus, when they then went into simulation, they did slightly better than the group who didn't have the AR, VR prep. But that's nice, but does it matter? You know, do we need them to be a bit better when they go into the simulation, or are they going to learn through the simulation anyway? And then what are the gains for the simulation in the longer term anyhow? But generally speaking, the evidence regarding any measurable educational outcomes from AI-powered interventions is pathetic, pretty much non-existent. But there is pressure to buy technology, to integrate it into medical and other programs. So that's fine. But I think the key thing is integrating it pedagogically, integrating it with other aspects of the curriculum. Only then it may add something. But also look at the cost and the sustainability. So questions to consider if we're building the evidence base. What did it cost? The basics. How much do AR headsets that nobody used cost? What were the outcomes relative to the costs? Other than the students liked it. And what else needs to be accounted in terms of the kind of the wider value or the drivers? I really had so much pressure put on me to buy all this kind of expensive kit by the new university management because Singapore wants to be seen as having all the shiny toys. It's part of the kind of the way the country presents itself internationally. Even if they don't add anything, they want it in terms of image. I wasn't really didn't really go for that. And how were cost and value balanced in the decision making? So I think that cost and value studies are particularly of interest where costs are particularly high or where resources are particularly scarce. And maybe that's where these studies are really useful. But I think we should all be doing them because we all have limited resources. Money is finite, staff time is finite. Let's make this a really active area of research to use to inform our evidence base, just as we do other studies. So in conclusion, going back to where I started, medical education is expensive, finite resources, choices need to be made between alternatives, and you need to know about cost as well as validity, as well as reliability, as well as educational impact when deciding how to spend money. So thank you, and I look forward to questions. Oh.
I'm just tech support. Look at the questions. So
Okay.
Thank you so much.
And can I ask, are you just saving money by not putting the heating on?
Absolutely. And it's also keeping people awake. So it has an impact as well. Nobody could possibly fall asleep though in that really fascinating talk. And I think, yeah, when she gave me a list of 3 options, I thought for the current state of affairs, this was entirely the right way for us to engage with this talk. I'm going to handle questions in the room first, and you're going to look at questions and just tell me. Brilliant. Thank you very much. And I'm thrilled to say the first question is from Ronald himself.
First of all, Jennifer, thanks for a very important and topical issue. 2 questions. Obviously, I was interested in the OSCE's costings, but what I was really wondering was why £65,000 sounded a lot of money. If you look at it per student, it's less than 400. And is it not unreasonable to spend 400? That's less than 1% of the cost of training a medical student in their final assessment. So if you look at that in that light, I wonder if that really is an issue. The second question was, you talked about the values and cost against values. And the trouble is that most of the studies you're talking about values in terms of short-term achieving short-term competencies. What are the competencies of that student on qualifying for medical school? Whereas what we're looking much more now at the challenge of future-proofing the student. Are you really equipping the student for their lifetime career in medicine with all that involves? So it's the values are changing, and all the studies showed really were short-term values.
Well, let me deal with that one first. I think that as a field, we're very poor. And generally, it's not just about cost and value, but we assess the things that are easy to assess, which is the immediate gains. There's very little research that does the longer term follow-up of whether X has an impact on clinical practice. So as a field, we need to improve on that, and cost and value research is no different. In terms of your first question, which was about you've obviously been doing some sums, the cost per head of the OSCE, but you're saying it's less than 1% of the cost of the cost of medical education. But all those 1% add up, and they probably come to more than 100% at the end of it. You know, everything we do has a cost. So if we can save money here and there without any loss of educational value or then let's do it, because the more and more students are being squeezed in, but the money is not really, the income is not commensurate with the expenditure. It's like the old adage of everyone's grandmother, look after the pennies and the pounds will look after themselves. Does that help?
Yes, no. I mean, I think
Yes,
the
no.
other argument, of course, is that if you do away with the OSCE, the studies have shown that the student's behavior has changed.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
it becomes less efficient in practice.
Mhm.
So
But it's not
the
about-
cost effective is the opportunities of doing away is a big problem.
Yes, because everything drives behavior, but the point is not about doing away with things, it's about doing things in a more efficient way. So such as the example of the teaching. So instead of a 30-minute simulation, a 20-minute simulation, they're still being taught, they're still getting the same learning, but just trying to kind of tweak around the edges.
There are a couple of comments online and then one question. So I'll go with the comments. So Emma Thompson, I suspect not that Emma Thompson, says, thank you so much. As a medical educator based in Malawi, okay, not that Emma Thompson, this was very pertinent, insightful. So,
Thank you.
and then Mona Al-Sheikh has said, we had the same experience with an interactive computer-based clinical cases, and we created a full lab for this, but it was completely abandoned. So I think this is in reference to the AR, VR, etc. Yeah, we in my field, respiratory medicine, bronchoscopy is just a computer game, effectively. You have a controller and a screen. You just navigate down lungs rather than down a cave or a maze. And we find that those trainees who've played Xbox or PlayStation have a bit of a head start.
Yeah.
But that head start goes away within about a month.
Yeah, that's
Everyone
right.
else catches up.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's nice if you keep playing the Xbox, Neil. That's the answer. All right, keep playing your Xbox. The question from Asan Sethi: could what represents a cost for the public sector actually serve as an income source for the private sector in medical education? Perhaps he's suggesting there's an opportunity for us to open a side gig.
I'm not sure I know what the question is. I'm sorry. What is a cost for the public sector? Could be an income source for the private sector. So we could, what's the phrase? Outsource things?
Or we could be the outsource.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Perhaps if you've got more comments, just say what your question is, Ashan. You could put them in the comments. We'll come back to you. We'll move to the audience.
Yeah.
Back to Neil.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And thanks so much for a fantastic presentation, Jen. I had a brief comment that leads to a question, if that's okay. And your example of the ward simulation exercise made me think of ours, because we similarly run a ward simulation exercise where we looked for all the same reasons to do it more efficiently and to save money and in doing so and in the process, and we've got a number of examples. Sorry, I work in the sim center here. A number of examples of when you look to save money or do something more efficiently, you end up not only saving money and doing something more efficiently, but you end up with a better learning intervention. And I wondered, so my question was, do you have any other advice or any resources of how people have usefully used analysis of cost in their design of their learning activity? Which sort of, I guess, serves both masters, because often it's very easy in retrospect to go, that's way too, like Craig did, that's ludicrously expensive, how can we do it better and then end up with a better product? But to do that, we look at cost as we develop things, but it never seems to actually end up in something efficient and doesn't get the most for our money. Have you come across examples, or do you have resources of how you usefully do that when you're designing simulation or other learning tools?
I think there was a group, Martin Tolsgaard and colleague in Copenhagen, that did do something prospectively, and something to do with obstetric simulation. I can dig it up for you, but I'm a bit vague on it. But they did something quite interesting. The other thing is that I do think that we're not very good at taking this into account. And we did a qualitative study a few years ago and spoke to, what do you call it, opinion leaders around the world, and said, what about cost? What about thinking of the cost and value of things? And people were like, oh, but that's for the economists. Or, oh, and there was a sense that it was distasteful to think about money. And I'm like, but we all complain that we don't have any at work. We complain we don't have any at home, but we certainly complain at work that there's not enough money. But you're not going, how can you address this issue? How can you make the most of what you've got unless you do even some fairly basic cost and value analyses, or even just cost, figure out what things cost and take it from there.
I'm going to go back here, then I'll go back to you, Rory. So a question from a previous student. Asim Ahmed says, thank you so much for the presentation. It's so enlightening. As a former student, we didn't pay much attention to the actual cost of producing us to society. I suspect as a physician, I guess it all evolves around the principles, values of social accountability of medical schools. The 4 values need to be existing in harmony without jeopardizing each other.
Yeah.
Once again, thanks. So not a question, but I thought it was quite a nice comment from a previous student. Oh, there's lots of questions coming. I'll jump to Kevin McConville, who said, thanks, Jen. We struggle at the moment with our social sciences, in quotes, cohorts, whom have a few field trips for experiential learning and off-site encounters. They go all the way to Edinburgh. But costings are scrutinized, whilst the lab-based cohorts are fine to go ahead, even when the lab costs are less transparent. There's no question there. There's just an ellipsis, which I think counts as the question.
Again, I think you need to have some costs. And certainly, having to do presentations to senior university management when I was vice dean, they did like the figures. They did like the data on costs, as well as the data on why this would be a good or less good educational thing to do. So maybe what Kevin needs to do is analyze the costs for the lab-based work versus the field work and say, well, hang on a minute, because if nobody knows the cost, how can they use that in the decision making?
Back to the room, boss.
No, look, Dan, thank you very much for the talk. And yeah, actually speaking as the Dean of Medicine, and in the university that's just gone through a fairly clear financial crisis, cost effectiveness is essential for we do what we want to do, because as you said, we can't control the income that we get from students, because that's set by government and all other costs rise. Combining that quality assessment with a cost effectiveness assessment, I think is hugely important if we are to do what we want to do. But I wanted to ask a slightly broader question around assessment, because you dealt with assessment in terms of MMIs and grades in the lottery system. But in terms of how we're doing that assessment, what we're seeing at the moment is a number of students coming through who aren't really able to cope with the high stress and complex environment of medicine. Assessing the right things and whether there are other things we ought to be doing assessment to try and mitigate against that in the longer term, which is not just about intellectual ability, how you handle questions.
Okay, so I mean, mostly in medicine we assess, well, you've got the OSCE for clinical skills and knowledge, and then you've got a written exam. And I think you're implying that there are things that are important to assess that might not really fit into the traditional formats. So, and then there's workplace-based assessments, but I can't help but think of the whole hidden curriculum. You know, because students will think that what we assess is important.
Neuro BIN 40, right?
So you would need to formulate a way of assessing students and making sure that they realise that this is pass-fail. This is important, for them to start taking it seriously. I don't know what the format would be, but if you bring it in, then it would change the attitudes of students towards something being important or less important. Is that a bit vague? Yeah. Okay.
Marwa Schumann has said, what do you think about the cost of accreditation? The high fees medical schools have to pay the accreditation bodies.
Oh, I don't know if I should say anything, but I'm not sure I should say what's going through my mind, because I might be like struck off or something.
You can take a sidestep. You can have a mulligan on that. That's not a problem.
Yeah.
You're the guest.
I think in our system, well, you know, accreditation systems are different in different parts of the world, and they come with different costs. But if you have to do it, you have to do it, and it has to be built in.
Any more questions from the floor? Ronald, Professor Harden like to make another comment?
And I think accreditation, again, everything you said about that, I'm thinking about our own quality assurance processes in the university and with the GMC.
Mhm.
We need to be looking at the costs of those and the benefits, and actually looking at everything that we do and thinking, can we work
Right.
more efficiently? Because it does take a lot of time.
Well, it's interesting, sorry, before Ronald's question, I led this big massive curriculum reform. It was the last thing I did as vice dean, and it just about finished me off. But it was thousands and thousands and thousands of staff hours to plan and then implement the curriculum reform. And you know what? It's probably nudged our degrees slightly along, 2 or 3%, but certainly not if I was looking at cost value, it wasn't worth it. Yeah.
I think you did refer to the judging against the improvement in healthcare delivery, not just short-term outcomes. And I just wonder if that's an area we need to spend more effort in. I mean, Bill McGahey did the excellent study in Chicago where he persuaded the hospital board to spend more money on postgraduate training. And then they showed that that extra money spent on postgraduate training was more than saved by the expenses within the healthcare delivery system.
I mean, I think that we need to do all those studies, but for some reason they're just not done. I think they're difficult to do. And they are time consuming and they're quite expensive in terms of the resources you need to do the research, but they're absolutely necessary because we as a field, we look at the short-term gains and that's about it. So I think the short answer is yes, we absolutely have to do that.
Okay, I think we're coming to a conclusion here, and we are out of questions. At the peak attendance online, we had 93 people in the audience, and I've counted roughly 53 people here. So that makes us the record attendance for 2025. So you can see the enthusiasm that the audience have had today. So thank you very much for coming. This has, as I said, been, I think, the coldest Ronald Harden lecture we've ever had, and I think it's now, I'll check online, but I think we're now 8 or 9 of these, so you're in very good company, and we again always thank Professor Harden for all the work he did for decades here to turn Dundee into such a powerhouse of medical education, and we give this named lecture in recognition of that, and thank you once again for being here in person. You're always here online if it's available to come in person. We really, really do appreciate that. So thank you very much. Spontaneous round of applause, everyone. But of course, we shouldn't let Jen leave without thanking her for coming here. Singapore's a long way away, and it's a lot warmer.
I've just forgotten what it's like to be in Scotland. So
Jen and I met in 2004. We were just reflecting on, we cycled from Los Angeles to San Diego together. It was a lot warmer those few days, wasn't it?
yeah, I was doing respiratory research at the time, and Tom and I, hard to believe now, but we were the youngsters. And there was all these very senior respiratory physicians. And there was one part of the journey that we had to climb in the back of a van to go through a military zone. And we were like, if this van's blown up, it's like respiratory medicine in Scotland will be knocked back about 10 years.
That's the trip to Park Pendleton was a little dicey, wasn't it? But how nice to see you again. She said that I look a bit older and a bit more beardy. You're exactly the same, Jen. So tune in next week to Grand Rounds. We will have Antimicrobial Resistance Awareness Week, and Helen Calaby and team are going to talk about that. It will be back online only, so don't turn up here to tune in online.
So as a very small token of our appreciation, I'd like to present you with this framed certificate, because I happen to know you are going to have to crush all your luggage into Ryanair. If however you want to leave the frame with us and pick it up another time, that is absolutely fine. And many thanks also to Susan and to Emily for doing all the organisation of this. Thank you so much. And thank you again, Ronald, and indeed Pat, are we allowed to say right-hand man, for so many years, and the huge, huge impact that you have made on medical education, and the very good hands now that medical teacher and so much else is now. It's lovely to see that continuation. Thank you so much.